The Crito is the last of the Socratic dialogues that Plato wrote that we're going to consider in this class. He wrote others, but this is the last one for us. The Socratic dialogues refer to the dialogues that Plato wrote early on in his philosophical career. The later dialogues that he writes reflect his own philosophical position. In the Crito, we see Socrates in prison awaiting his execution after the trial which took place in the Apology, which we read last week, and we've talked about that last week. So here we're continuing the arc of the story as Socrates is languishing now in prison awaiting his execution, and we will ultimately conclude this arc with a brief look at the Phaedo, which I'll talk about at the end of this discussion, which, amongst other things, has a scene in which the death of Socrates is presented to us by Plato. The central theme of the Crito is the relationship of the individual to the state. That is, what relationship do you, as a rational, moral being, have to the collective will of the state? Can the state just make you do whatever it decides, and must you do whatever the state determines you should do? This is an issue that the Greeks were very concerned with, as we are to this very day. You may have read in the course of your studies the play by Sophocles called Antigone, which represents kind of the diametrically opposed viewpoint that Socrates will take in the Crito. In the Antigone, Antigone's brother is killed, and she wants to bury his body so that he can go to the underworld and not suffer. But she's not permitted to bury him by Creon, who views her brother as a traitor. And so basically she does it anyway. She defies the laws of the state and says that she's doing so because her own individual moral judgment supersedes the pronouncements of any particular lawmaker within a society. We're going to see relatively the opposite position in the Crito, and that's going to be kind of a tricky thing. In the Crito, Socrates is going to defend what appears to be, anyway, a very authoritarian point of view that seems to give priority to the state over the individual's free moral decisions. And now this causes us some controversy. This is kind of a tricky situation because the issue then becomes, well, how do we reconcile that particular position of Socrates in the Crito with what Socrates seems to say in the Apology? In the Crito, he seems to say you should follow the laws no matter what. In the Apology, he seems to say, if the laws command me to stop doing philosophy, I'm going to rebel and I'm not going to obey. So that creates a little bit of an issue that we'll talk about at the end of this discussion. So also in the Crito, we're going to get a anticipation of a theory called the social contract theory. It's kind of a prototypical form of the social contract theory, which we'll see more fully developed later on in the class, but the basic idea will be presented here. That is, that in some way there's a contract relationship that is implicit between citizens and the state in which they live. The Crito takes place after the Apology, almost immediately thereafter. Socrates is in prison awaiting execution following his trial. The execution was delayed due to a religious mission to the island of Delos. This was a mission in honor of the slaying of the Minotaur by Theseus, which you might have read about in your studies of Greek mythology. During that religious mission, all executions were placed on hold, and so Socrates is languishing in prison for a while, and he gets a visit from his friend Crito, who's come to convince him that rather than wait around for his ultimate execution, he should escape. And so Crito is going to present a plan of escape to Socrates. The Crito is controversial because the view articulated in it seems to be at odds with the view in the Apology. In the Apology, Socrates appeared willing to defy the law in defense of his religious mission and in defense of the philosophical life. In the Crito, when Socrates gives his position, which is presented when he is speaking for the laws of Athens, the position he gives seems to be the exact opposite. He seems to be arguing for the priority of the state over the individual citizen. So then the question becomes, well, which is the view of Socrates? If they're both the view of Socrates as I've laid out, then it appears as though he's quite muddled up, that he's got a position that doesn't make any sense. If you can't hold both of those positions, it seems, on the face of it. And so one thing I'll try to do at the end of this dialogue is give you some of the suggestions that interpreters have made to try to solve this particular interpretive issue. I find it useful to divide the dialogue up into 5 separate sections. There's the introduction, where we get the meeting of Crito and Socrates in the prison cell. Then we'll look at Crito's arguments why Socrates should escape. And then we'll get Socrates' initial response as he restates the moral principles that will support his ultimate argument. And then we'll get the argument of Socrates, which is kind of tricky because he presents it as though he's speaking for the laws of Athens. But the laws of Athens is basically Socrates' position. And then we'll get finally the law's reply to the arguments that Crito had initially made. So the dialogue takes place in a room in the state prison in Athens in the year 399 BCE. It's about a half an hour before dawn. The room would be almost dark. There might be a little oil lamp next to the bed. The bed is against the back wall. And Crito is sitting patiently on a stool at the foot of the bed, waiting for Socrates to wake up. Socrates is sleeping. Crito has bribed the guard to be let in, and he's sitting there at the foot of the bed under a great emotional stress because he's very disturbed that his friend is soon going to die. Socrates wakes up. He appears very calm in the face of his pending execution, and they discuss whether or not the boat has actually been sighted and is soon going to arrive that will indicate that Socrates has to die. The idea is that once the boat arrives, Socrates will be executed the next day, and there has been word that the boat is going to arrive today, which means that he will be executed tomorrow unless he makes his escape. Crito then presents several arguments in favor of Socrates escaping from prison. First of all, he says, by allowing himself to be executed by the state, Socrates is endangering the good reputation of his friends. People will think that his friends were either too cheap or too cowardly to help him, and they allowed him to die. And think of your friend's reputation, Socrates. That's not going to sit very well with other people. He says that he has friends who are willing to take the risk. He and his friends are willing to take the risk. They have a source of money to bribe the guards and finance the escape. We have a place for you to go in another state, which is probably going to be Thessaly in the north of the Athenian peninsula. He says that if he doesn't escape, Socrates would be acting unjustly by, in a way, contributing to the efforts of his enemies to get rid of him. He will be playing right into their hands. He says that Socrates would be acting unjustly by abandoning his parental responsibilities. He has 2 sons that would be without a father, and so therefore he would be abandoning his children. And also Crito concludes that it's cowardly to accept the situation without resistance. Now, the principal thing to note about Crito's arguments is that they're all prudential arguments. That is, they all talk about the practicality of getting Socrates out of prison. There are some obstacles. They can be surmounted. And they describe how it might be in Socrates or Crito's best interest for Socrates to escape. But Socrates is operating at a kind of a different level here. He's not really concerned about the feasibility of escape. Socrates is more concerned with whether or not it's the right thing to do. So even though these are good prudential arguments, perhaps or perhaps not, nevertheless, they don't have anything to do with whether or not escaping would be the morally proper thing. So one thing that Crito's arguments do appear to assume is that most people would probably think it's normal for Socrates to try to escape back then. In fact, if he didn't, many people would think that would be unusual. part of this has to do with the fact that he was given an opportunity to choose the alternative penalty of banishment during the apology and didn't take up the offer and didn't pursue that line of approach. And so therefore this might be another chance for him to basically avail himself of that opportunity. So Socrates, however, doesn't really care about public opinion. He doesn't care what the many think. He says it's the opinion of the wise, those who know, and not the many, that matters. This theme, in a way, anticipates a kind of an aristocratic outlook that we'll see more developed in a more extreme form in Plato. And it's one of the reasons for Plato's opposition to democratic society. We'll talk about that in coming weeks as we talk about Plato's Republic, but the basic idea is that in a democracy, the many are in charge. That is, the majority rules. But the vast majority of these people are not well informed about political matters or statecraft, and they don't know what they're doing. And so when you put them in charge of the state, you're putting the least qualified people in charge. Rather, he's going to argue it should be the wise that should rule. So we're kind of getting an anticipation here in this writing about Socrates, where Plato will ultimately go in terms of his political philosophy. So just to recap, the central question for Socrates is not, is escape feasible, but is it just? That is it just in the sense of, is it the right thing to do? Is it morally right to escape from prison, or should he not escape and face his penalty? Before considering the specifically moral questions involved, which we'll get to in just a second, Socrates begins with a brief overview of his basic philosophical position in general. And as we've already seen, he clearly holds that we should respect the judgments of experts and not the majority in all matters, but especially in matters of justice. There's a lot of plausibility to this, at least to a certain extent. I mean, if you have a serious illness, for example, you don't take a poll of your friends to determine what's wrong with you. You go to an expert in medicine to diagnose you. Well, similarly, Socrates and later Plato will argue that in matters of the state, it should be an issue where the experts rule and the experts determine what is right or what is wrong. Ultimately, it's going to turn out the experts in justice, by the way, the experts in statecraft, will be philosophers, oddly enough. So that'll be a theme we'll explore next week. So that's the first idea here. We should respect the judgments of experts, not the majority. So it's the wise and not the many that matter. For Socrates, it is the soul that is more important than the body. And so this is hearkening to this notion that the body is in a way the prison of the soul, and ultimately the soul wants to escape from the body to a domain of freedom, so to speak, and enlightenment. And so we want to care for our soul, and that's the more important element of a human being. And therefore, related to that, Socrates argues that we should therefore never commit injustice or do the wrong thing, because injustice or doing the wrong thing ruins the soul, and that would be ruining the most important part of us. So these are some background ideas that Socrates brings up to remind Crito of his general standpoint, the position from which he's coming at this question of escape. Socrates' reply to Crito is going to rest on several moral principles, the first of which is that to commit injustice is always wrong. We've already seen the reason for this, because committing injustice ruins the soul and therefore damages not only the person you do the injustice to, but yourself as well. And therefore, since injustice always harms both the victim and the perpetrator, Socrates says even in cases where you've been wronged, it's not legitimate to commit injustice against somebody else. Secondly, he argues, and this is kind of a corollary, that we ought not to inflict injuries even in retaliation for being injured. And finally, when we make agreements or contracts, we enter into an obligation to fulfill our agreements or our contracts. So this is something that we have to do. So these are the three principles that are going to be appealed to in the arguments that Socrates is going to make. Now, for the ancient Greeks, justice and injustice were actions that were directed against other people. They didn't really have this a clear idea of committing injustice against the state or against an abstract entity like the state. So therefore, in order to make this idea somewhat more plausible that Socrates is trying to develop, he casts the state as a person. He casts the laws of Athens as a person who now enters into the dialogue. And so this personification of the laws of Athens becomes the person that we need to convince that escape is the right thing to do. As Socrates says, if we leave this place without first persuading the state to let us go, are we or are we not doing an injury and doing it to those we've the least excuse for injuring? Are we or are we not abiding by our just agreements? And so these are the questions that need to be answered before the decision to escape could be justified. So therefore he concludes, if I'm not able to persuade the laws that escape is the right thing to do, then I must obey the law and not escape, basically. So we have the laws of Athens personified. Socrates is making the case for the laws. And he's going to appeal to the moral principles that he's already just established. The first principle that he appeals to is the harm principle. We could call it that it's always wrong to cause harm. Well, if it's always wrong to cause harm, then the laws of Athens argue that it would be wrong for Socrates to escape, because if he did, it would cause harm to the state. A state cannot exist if legal judgments can be nullified by private judgments. So it's not that the specific escape of Socrates would cause Athens to crumble, but rather it's a principled point that a state can't function unless its laws have force. And if individuals can just decide which ones they follow and which ones they don't, that would in fact lead to the destruction of the state, which of course would cause harm. So therefore, since it would be harmful to the state in that sense, the laws conclude that it would be wrong for Socrates to escape. Similarly, as we saw earlier, Socrates says that when you enter into an agreement or a contract, you have an obligation to fulfill that agreement or contract. And the laws argue that the relationship that Socrates has with the state is an agreement similar to the relationship between a child and her parents. That is, in ancient Athenian society, children owed their parents an obligation of respect and obedience. Basically, they had to do what their parents said. The parents were in charge. The parents were directing them. The parents protected them and raised them. And in so doing, that creates an agreement, so to speak, between the child and the parents where the child has to obey. Now, of course, if Socrates escapes from prison and therefore disobeys, he would be violating this compact that has been made, somewhat implicitly, but nevertheless would be violating it nevertheless. Finally, the laws say that Socrates had plenty of chances to leave at any time during his entire 70 years on Earth if he had decided or thought that the laws of Athens were in some way wrong or inappropriate or something that he didn't agree with. He could have gone somewhere else, but he never did. Notoriously, Socrates is kind of like the arch Athenian. He loves the city of Athens, and he rarely left except for maybe military obligations. And so by staying, the laws of Athens argue that implicitly, when you could have left but you decided to stay, you've entered into an agreement, a social contract with the state by remaining. So you've entered into this agreement, and therefore you need to follow the laws because that's part of the contract. If you disagreed with the laws, you could have left. So these are the three principal arguments that Socrates makes. Now, these are not all equally good arguments. I think they're all valid arguments, but that does not necessarily mean that the conclusion is a true statement. I do agree with the first argument of the laws. That is, if individuals could decide which laws to follow and which not, that would clearly lead to the downfall of society and the state. That seems to be perhaps the best argument that is presented. The analogy of the citizen to the state as a child to their parents, that one seems a little bit forced to me. I don't think that that those two things are similar enough to warrant the conclusion that Socrates or the Laws of Athens tries to draw. Finally, with respect to the third argument, there is some legitimacy to this notion of a social contract, of an implicit contract. It's not like we sign a contract to follow the laws when we're born in a particular society. We are just born in that society, and that comes to be assumed as part of our relationship with the society or the state. So I think that there's some high degree of plausibility to that argument as well. So they're not all equally good. I think the second one's a little bit of a weak analogy, but clearly the first and the third are the strongest of the three that are presented. So the laws are not convinced. The Laws of Athens maintain that it would be wrong for Socrates to escape. They have not been persuaded otherwise, and therefore that's their position. And by default, that's also Socrates' position as well. Now, we've had Crito's arguments, and now we've had Socrates' arguments for their individual positions, and then the dialogue finally turns in the end to a criticism of the arguments that Crito has made. So we see the arguments that Socrates' escape would achieve nothing, basically. His friends will be punished for his escape by banishment or the confiscation of their property, so they will be harmed. When Socrates goes to this other country, whatever it might be, he'll be branded with the stigma of being a lawbreaker, and no one would respect him, and everyone would be suspicious of him. If he were to escape and break the law, that would in fact confirm the verdict of the jurors that he's a corrupting influence in society. I mean, it seems clear that someone who's willing to break the law is not going to be a good, positive influence, especially on the young people who might be emulating Socrates. So that would be a terrible thing to confirm the verdict. Escape would make a mockery of his previous moral views. Those are the views we articulated earlier with respect to not causing harm, never doing injustice, following your contracts. All those would just fly out the window and therefore would make his moral position collapse, essentially. It is unseemly and humiliating for an elderly man to cling so desperately to life. Yeah, this is one we need to talk about just very briefly. Socrates is 70 years old at the time of this dialogue. I used to think 70 was a lot older than I think it is now. I think 70 is like the new 50, but back then 70 was like the new 200, because the average life expectancy was about 15 years old in ancient Athens. So for someone of 70 years old to be clinging for an extra few months or years of life does seem a little bit unseemly. Socrates argues that if he were to escape, it would not help his sons. It would make them foreigners. They would have no social position in the land in which they went to. And in any case, Socrates' friends will care for his sons in the event of his death. Socrates was notoriously poor, and his wife, Xanthippe, was notoriously always angry at him for not working as hard as he probably could because he was doing philosophy all the time. But Socrates did have a lot of very wealthy friends, including Plato. Plato is from an aristocratic family, had lots of money. As we saw earlier, he even volunteered to pay the fine that Socrates faced in the Apology. So he says, my friends will be able to take care of my sons in the event of my death. And finally, if he were to escape and commit this act of injustice, when he does ultimately go into the other world, to Hades, as the Greeks referred to it, he would face his judges in the underworld, and they would not look favorably upon this action. So therefore the laws, in this case, the idea of escaping would carry not only a penalty in this world, but in the other world, the next life as well. Now, as I said earlier, there's an interpretive issue of trying to reconcile the Crito with the Apology. And I'm just going to summarize a few of the basic strategies that you could take in trying to sort out this particular issue. One strategy is to argue that the character of Socrates in the Crito and in the Apology are consistent. That is, there's no inconsistency or there's no contradiction between the two. That they both reflect the fundamental Socratic view that we must act only from our own convictions, and that we must act only on what reason tells us is the right thing to do. This is what Socrates says in the Apology. And this is what he says in the Crito as well. He doesn't do something, he doesn't escape because people think it would be expected, or the majority thinks it's a good idea, or that Crito thinks it's a good idea. He's got to think it through for himself. So I'm calling this the Socratic approach, the idea that both of these positions are consistent. And part of this involves having to maintain that the Crito is a relatively early dialogue, early in the sense that it was written early in Plato's philosophical career, and it was written close to the time of the Apology. So the two views that we see articulated here are similar. Now, there's a different approach that some interpreters take, and this is going to be the approach that Stephen Smith takes in the video lecture from the Yale Political Philosophy series that I'm putting with this material. His approach is somewhat different. He's going to take the approach that the ideas that we see articulated by Socrates in the Crito are not really Socrates' views, but they're actually Plato's positions. That Plato is using Socrates kind of as a spokesperson to articulate Plato's own particular views. So I call this the Platonic approach. So the idea here is that the Crito is actually a later dialogue written years later when Plato has developed his own unique political perspective. I'm not completely convinced by this, but it does solve the problem relatively easily. But I don't think that it's the best solution, but it is one that is quite common. You could go for a blended or a kind of a compromise position as well and argue that the Crito emphasizes the political ideas that Socrates and Plato do share. Both indeed are suspicious of democracy and public opinion. Both appear to say that the matters of the state should be determined by the experts who know. So those are two elements that Plato and Socrates do in fact share. So you might see the Crito as kind of a transitional dialogue where the position, although moving away from the position in the Apology, is still consistent with what Socrates said earlier, but is also moving towards emphasizing those commonalities that Plato and Socrates share together. So you can look these over and kind of think this through. I think that an excellent test question for an exam might be to defend one of these positions and tell me which one you think is the most plausible. So that might be something you may want to reflect on for what comes up down the road. In a dialogue called the Phaedo, Plato records for us in dramatic fashion the execution of Socrates by means of hemlock poisoning. That is the end of Socrates, but it's also the beginning of a whole tradition of Greek philosophy that takes us from Plato to Aristotle and beyond. We're going to look at a little bit of Plato's philosophy as we transition from Socrates to Plato this week, and then we'll go into great detail next week when we dive into the Republic per se. In Plato's 7th letter, he talks about how the experience of the execution of Socrates, who was, by all accounts, he was the most virtuous person in all of Athens, convinced Plato of the corrupt nature of his society, and therefore turns him away from a life of politics and towards a life of philosophy. His goal becomes reforming the corrupt nature of a city that would kill its best people. And in order to do this reform, he is determined to create a plan that would make the state better, and in fact would make the state as perfect as it could possibly be made given human nature. And we're going to see that plan, at least in some of its parts, in next week when we look at the Republic. So now, before we get into Plato's 7th letter and other issues relating to Plato's philosophy, we're going to make a brief little pause and consider the arguments of the Crito from an alternative perspective. And I've included in the next unit, the next unit lesson for this week, a bit of an article by Henry David Thoreau called On the Duty of Civil Disobedience, in which we're going to see articulated the exact opposite position, perhaps, that Socrates had. And so we'll consider that, because that kind of gives us a nice counterpoint that we can see which position is perhaps defended better. And then we'll move on again to transition into Plato's philosophy.